Let's enter now into the outlook, part 3 of today's summit, where we're going to kick off with a nice case study by my Roche colleagues, Kirsten, Staunton, and Florian Lipsmeier, on the outcome measures based on digital health technology sensor data. So the team is working together in a very integrated way. Another connection to what I mentioned very early on in the panel discussion, where I said that kind of in particular, the maturity, I think, of our organizational setup has evolved throughout the last year. That was really, for me, one of the highlights. So looking very much forward to see now the team presenting on their outcome and their results and their thinking going forward. Kirsten, please take it from here.
Thank you very much. We would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to tell you about the work we've been doing in Roche Pharma and early development, and also Roche Products Limited, to build outcome measures based on digital health technology sensor data. And it's so nice that we come at this stage in the meeting today, because we believe that what we've heard, it really builds up to and underscores what we'll be saying about building these measures and the strategies that we've developed to do so. So our disclosures, we are all full-time employees of F. Hoffmann La Roche. So this can go very quickly, because I think we're all on the same page here. There's a great promise for sensor-derived endpoints. We have the possibility, of course, to more accurately quantify disease trajectories with these remote and frequent assessments using these sensitive sensors. The data promise to be more patient relevant because they are collected where patients live and work, and also passive monitoring measures are actually measuring what patients are doing during their daily lives. We are seeing higher signal to noise outcome measures, promising faster trials or fewer patients to get medicines to patients faster. So the question, of course, is how can these endpoints based on digital health technology data be developed? And as you've heard also earlier today, one needs to begin with a clearly defined context of use. So how should the outcome measure be used? And in the strategies that we'll be discussing today, we're going to use the case example of measuring treatment response in early stage Parkinson's disease patients. You've also heard about the importance of the concept of interest from Jeremy. So which aspects of the disease should be measured? Here, motor disease progression in Parkinson's disease will be used as a case example. And of course, once these have been defined, it's important then to identify the robust, i.e. reliable and valid digital health technology tool. And what we'd like to focus on in our talk is really what to do with these huge amounts of sensor data from which meaningful features are extracted, and how to combine them into a single measure that recapitulates the disease severity. So we believe that there are two ways of doing this, and one is what we call a patient-centric approach. And in this example, the concept of interest would be, for example, the core signs relevant to patients' functioning in everyday lives. Here, feature selection should be driven by the voice of the patient. So having patients tell us what matters most to them, as we've heard earlier. Of course, the advantage is that we're very close to the patient, and it would meet regulatory expectations regarding clinical outcomes assessments to measure how patients function. However, we do believe that there is space for an alternative approach, which we are calling a data-centric approach. In this example, it would be a measure of disease progression. And we suggest that feature selection may be driven by the data. And if the context of use is to measure a treatment response, then the characteristic that should be used to select the features would be changed over time. This approach would have the advantages of drawing on a larger pool of features and may therefore be more sensitive to disease progression. It would also assess signs that patients don't report as bothersome, but are important indicators of changes in the disease course. And now we'd like to dive into these two different approaches. And so at this point, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Hannah Staunton, who is a patient-centered outcomes scientist.
Thank you, Kirsten. So as Kirsten described, I'm going to walk through developing a patient-centered digital endpoint that measures what matters to patients. And this approach has been modeled based on existing regulatory clinical outcome assessment guidance documents, such as the FDA Patient-Focused Drug Development Guidance 3, which documents how to develop, select, and modify fit-for-purpose clinical outcome assessments. And at the core of this is really measuring what matters to patients and assessing concepts where possible in an objective way. And the intended use here is a clinical trial endpoint to measure patient symptoms or functioning that would go alongside traditional clinical outcome assessments. And so the start of this process is really the patient voice to identify those relevant symptoms and functional impacts in order to create meaningful digital tasks and associated features. And these could be active tasks where the patient actively engages, or they could be passively collected parameters. The next stage would involve a review and refinement of these tasks and associated features with clinical experts. And finally, of course, a statistical step involving assessing the reliability, the validity, and the ability to detect change of the ensuing outcome. And all of this would result in a statistically robust digital endpoint that assesses a patient-relevant concept. And so just going through this in more detail then, and starting with establishing the patient and the clinical perspective. So ideally, there would be a prospective qualitative study or leveraging existing qualitative patient voice data to define that concept of interest of importance, and then to subsequently select the technology. However, the digital field is moving very quickly. In some cases, digital devices and concepts already exist. And so there is opportunity to retrospectively establish content validity and to aid with the refinement of the most appropriate features, as I'll now describe. So in this hypothetical case study, we have a patient with Parkinson's who describes issues with grip and hand coordination that impact everyday life in terms of dressing and writing. And the patient is then asked to complete a draw or shape the task. And you can see here two hypothetical patients. Patient A, who struggles in terms of precision, and patient B, who is much slower and has difficulties in terms of coordination, in terms of going around the corners, some hesitation. You would then ask the patient to comment on the difficulties they experience with this task and how this relates to everyday life. And so we might hear from patients at this point regarding issues with speed, accuracy, coordination, similar to when, for example, using an iPad or writing or performing everyday activities of daily living, such as dressing. From here, of course, we can select many different features from this single drawer shape task. But to remain focused on what matters to the patients, we might select features that focus on speed, accuracy, so precision in terms of keeping close to the line, coordination in terms of degree of jerk, and review these as appropriate with expert clinicians. So once we have our patient relevant concept and concept of interest, from this point, it is important to establish reliability, validity, and other measurement properties. And in terms of the features that have been identified as being important and relevant, we would want to ensure appropriate test-retest reliability, that patients do indeed remain stable on the outcome, and appropriate change over time. And from here, the next step would be to develop an appropriate scoring algorithm with a focus really on generating a simple and interpretable score that remains true to those original features. And this could be informed, of course, by data reduction techniques such as factor analysis to inform whether it is possible to have a single score. After this, we'd want to assess the reliability. So again, the test-retest of the total score. Validity, so can the outcome distinguish between patients of different known groups and clinical severities? How does the outcome relate to existing clinical standards, so clinician-reported outcomes and patient-reported outcomes? Can the outcome detect change? And of course, what is a meaningful change on the particular outcome in terms of anchoring to an external criterion and being able to establish the meaningful change threshold? And the goal with all of this, to return to the original aim, is to develop a statistically robust digital endpoint that assesses a patient-relevant concept. And I'll now hand over to Florian, who will describe a data-centric approach.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Kirsten. So, I mean, I can only agree with Kirsten that this fits very well to the overall flow of the last presentations. So, what we have seen in the previous presentations was mainly endpoints driven by a single outcome, very well defined, like something from a 6-minute walk test. What Hannah just presented is a patient-centric approach on combining actually different features from different tests modalities in a meaningful way together. What I want now to basically finish on in our proposal is a data-centric approach where we actually basically let the data speak about the disease. What that means is that we actually want to leverage the outcomes of or the measurements we do with novel digital health technologies as good as possible. So we have this multitude of the abundance of data, multimodal sensor data often, and what everyone is basically promising is that this data has a possibility to carry information which is which has a high cross-sectional and longitudinal validity sensitivity, but also greater robustness and higher ecological validity because it is often measured at the home environment of the patient several times a day, many weeks of data. And the challenge here is actually, okay, what can you do to identify this information, condense it into an interpretable form? So that's also what you see in this visualization, basically coming back to the waveforms from the very beginning. So in the previous talk, you have these waveforms and many waveforms collected from many patients. Oftentimes you can condense them down into features, but then you have to select these features in a way to actually maximize on disease progression. Next slide, please. So that's where we propose something which we call the disease progression measure. And this disease progression measure is really driven by data. So what we propose here is a way forward where we build a global score combining sensor data or feature data out of sensor data from many different types of tests which a patient can do in the home setting or potential passive monitoring data from the daily life of the patient into something which is really based on the fastest progressing sensor features in a meaningful combination with the aim to reduce variability in the signal and potentially detect earlier signals in clinical trials. And the way we think about that is to take basically all these features we can get out of waveforms or whatever type of data you have in different types of ways, filter them for retest reliability and their ability to change over time, and then build more involved models which have actually this aim to maximize decline while minimizing variability, and that's also important, controlling for collinearity in order to get to what we call this disease progression measure. So this is really quite in contrast to all the things which have been shown before, because this can involve all types of features coming from very involved signal processing. So not necessarily something which is very well linked to what a patient is telling us about his disease, but it might nevertheless be able to be very sensitive about disease changes in early or pre-manifest disease stages. Next slide. So I have also the pleasure to briefly mention some of the key challenges. Some of them have also been mentioned before. So of course, very, very important, especially with this highly data intense driven model building, is the model information identification and validation. So the challenge to properly define build and validation sets. That's something which we also propose here, that you actually need that you actually need proper build and validation sets in both ways. It's the interpretability, especially when you have this more involved signal processing. It's also the QC, so when is data actually usable, especially when it's coming from the home setting of the patient. And very important also, what about the missingness? Is missingness there, and is it independent of disease severity or disease events, or is it actually something meaningful? So with that, I turn over again to Kirsten to wrap up our talk.
Thank you, Florian. So as Florian mentioned, it's been really an exciting day to hear about all of your learnings. And it's really fortunate. We feel very fortunate that we can come here as well and talk about our learnings to the extent they're similar, they're dissimilar, and how can we really complement one another. So we think clearly that there needs to be a fit for purpose digital endpoint solution. So depending on what you need for your study and what type of study it is. And this will be based, of course, on the concept of interest and the context of use. We've learned, as many of you have noted, that early interactions with regulatory authorities are very critical to understand their views on digital endpoint development. We've learned about the importance of incorporating the patient's voice into the endpoint development and feature selection. And in our experience in the last, I believe, 6 years that the Roche has been working on digital biomarkers for Parkinson's disease, certainly the extremely valuable learnings from a very early and iterative piloting phase towards optimizing a robust digital health technology solution. And with you, of course, we are committed to the field's aims for more open digital data sharing, and finally to work together to generate data required to build regulatory pathways for digital endpoints. And with that, we thank you for your attention and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, team. So there are a couple of questions. The first one that's most prominent is the one around kind of what success have you already had with this data-driven endpoint acceptability from a regulatory perspective? Anything you can comment there already?
So I think generally we've heard from FDA that they've been very interested in the patient's voice. So it's unclear the extent to which they would be receptive. I think that's what they would like to see in the first line as a first line solution. And it's unclear where they would slot such a data-centric approach and under which circumstances for which data exploration they would consider seeing these data. That's not clear to us. I think other regulators are potentially more open to seeing both approaches. Hannah, did you want to add something?
I think you've actually, captured it very well, Kirsten. When we look at the COA guidance and we look at the patient-focused drug development guidance, there's a clear pathway, and that does start with the patient voice and the establishment of content validity.
Very good. Another question that came up is around the the focus of this work. Do you really focus only on kind of the research application in clinical trials, or is there potential to go beyond that and potentially develop a medical device in the end? And if so, kind of what would be the route to get there?
We believe absolutely. And we had the opportunity to summarize our thoughts in a paper that's in press at NPJ Digital Medicine. And there we speak to that. For example, if you're looking for a screening tool, the same algorithm, so to speak, can be applied, just changing the criteria. So absolutely, we think that this can be very valuable for a number of different use cases. Or screening is one example. Another might be, providing patients feedback on information that's very important to them, and how to select those features, how to summarize those features that would be meaningful to patients. These are just a couple of examples. Of course, also the treating physicians' perspective. Florian and Hannah, do you want to add?
Nothing from my end.
Yes, so regarding the software as a medical device question, I think that's certainly something which is an important consideration, not only for us, but many other companies working on these type of approaches. I think going into, beyond clinical studies, of course, has all types of challenges, also different regulatory pathways compared to building endpoints in clinical studies. So while there's overlap, there's certainly also not only overlap, but also differences, which you have also to take into account when going to a medical device which you want to share in the public domain.
Thank you, Florian. Maybe one final question, since you're so much on time. Kind of have you considered new methods to do patient qualitative research, for example, social media listening or NLP, natural language processing on such data sources? Have you tapped into such sources as well?
Yes, I can start with this one. And we have looked into this and do consider that social media analysis does provide something unique that you might not get from traditional qualitative interviews and focus groups. So really it's the combination of that data ideally and that provides the most holistic perspective regarding patient insights and the symptoms and functional impacts that they're experiencing.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So thanks again for your great presentation, interesting Q&A.